Hello and welcome to this video where we look at mountains, the highest mountains in North America, and how they are ordered by mostly one unit of measurement ratio. That when you compare mountain to mountain distances here, we look at the ratio between the kilometer and the mile, ordering these distances. And also I'll show you one quick example, and not to make this a too long video, of how the meter-yard ratio also orders mountain distances here. And just to show you what I mean, if you haven't seen any of my other videos with mountains, here I placed marked the highest mountain here in the western United States, in each state here. And this is basically where all the high mountains are in the United States and Canada, to the west. And there is a yellow line here, or distance, between Mount Whitney, California's number one, and Mount Granite Peak up here, Montana's number one. And then we have a distance between Humphreys Peak, Arizona's number one here, and Guadalupe Peak, Texas number one. There is a ratio between these two distances as 1 kilometer to 1 mile. Whitney to Granite is as 1 mile, while Humphreys Peak to Guadalupe Peak is as 1 kilometer. Very, very near exactly. So I'll just start to measure this. And the selection criteria, if you will, for high mountains here has simply been to locate the highest mountain peak in each state here in the west, where we find the high mountains. And then I found these correlations. So this is the first pair of distances where we look at the kilometer-mile ratio, ordering the two. So let's fly down to Mount Whitney now and measure to Granite Peak in miles. So you see that I'm not full of it and just saying this. Here is the peak of Mount Whitney, though, in a second when it's cleared up here. So as you can see, Google have place marked the peak right here, and here this purple pin is my marker for the very peak. Sometimes you have to look around a little bit to locate it, and it's right here. So let's fly from Mount Whitney to Granite Peak. And I'll give you a number of 8 pairs here or thereabouts. So if you bear with me for 15 minutes or so, you can see this evidence for yourself here, of what I claimed in the beginning. So here we have a distance, if you look in the measure tool, of just under 740 miles. Let's say 739.65 there, the top row. So let's remember those numbers, 739.65, and let's clear this out, shift to kilometers, and fly to Humphreys Peak then, Arizona's number one, and measure to Guadalupe Peak, Texas number one. And here we should find 739.6 or so kilometers. Over here we have the very peak of Mount Humphreys Peak here, right there, and we'll fly from there to Guadalupe Peak. And 739.65 kilometers or so, just around here. And here is the peak of Guadalupe. And if you look in the measure tool there, you can see that if we stop it there, we have 739.7 or so in the lower value here, and a bit less in the upper row. So this is very near exactly then. So that these two distances, as I said, is Humphreys to Guadalupe as 1 kilometer and Whitney to Granite Peak as 1 mile. So that's the first example. I just keep adding the example here so you see what I mean. The next two pairs are these. If I zoom in a little bit, Boundary Peak in Nevada here, the highest mountain in Nevada. Boundary Peak to Kings Peak, Utah's highest mountain. And the other distance is then from Mount Whitney to Humphreys Peak. And the ratio here is Boundary to Kings Peak is as 2 kilometers, while Whitney to Humphreys is as 1 mile. So let's just measure first Boundary Peak to Kings Peak in kilometers. boundary peak, and here we have the very peak of it. Just a second here. So from here then, boundary peak to King's Peak. And the kilometer value that we have here, we'll divide it in half, and then we get the mile distance in the other value in the other distance. So let's say that here we have, let's say the average here, 761 divided in half. That's 380.5. 380.5. This number divided in half. So in the next distance here, from Mount Whitney, we're looking for 380.5 miles between Mount Whitney and Humphreys Peak. So let's measure. And here we are towards Humphreys Peak. And 380.5 miles is what we should find thereabouts here. And if you look, here is the peak. And if you look in the measure tool, we have just around 380.5 in the middle row here in miles. So very, very near exactly. The ratio here between these two is as 2 kilometers to 1 mile here between these two. 2 kilometers and 1 mile. The next pair, I'll stack up a few more pairs, so you see that this is common here, how mountain peaks are ordered when you compare distances. Here we have New Mexico here, Wheeler Peak, the highest mountain in New Mexico, and it has two distances. The shorter one is to Kings Peak, Utah's highest peak. The longer distance here is to Granite Peak, and that's Montana's highest mountain. And the shorter is as 1 kilometer, the longer is as 1 mile. That's the ratio there. So let's measure from Wheeler Peak to Kings Peak and Granite Peak. And first in kilometers to Kings Peak. And here then is the top point. We'll measure from here up to Kings Peak. And the distance we find here in kilometers is just around 636.6 kilometers. 636.6. You can see it here in the measure tool there. So that's what we should find in miles in the second distance to Granite Peak. So let's see if that's correct. So here we're flying from Wheeler Peak to Granite Peak. Montana's number 1. And in a second we have the peak right here. And if you look in the measure tool there, we find 636.6 miles just around there in the top row here. And a bit longer in the middle row. So this one is off, you can say, by a few hundred meters from being exactly in the ratio of 1 kilometer to 1 mile. These two distances. But very near exactly. 1 kilometer and 1 mile. Let's take a few more pairs. So to push the point home here. And this time we'll stay with Wheeler Peak, but this time we measure from Guadalupe Peak, Texas highest peak here. First up to Wheeler Peak, and think of that distance as 1 mile. 1 kilometer. And then we measure from Guadalupe again, down to this mountain in northern Mexico, Cerro San Rafael. And that's the highest mountain in northern Mexico, right here, in all of this area. And this time, Guadalupe to Wheeler, 1 kilometer. Guadalupe to Cerro San Rafael, 1 mile. So let's measure that from Guadalupe to those two others. First in kilometers to Wheeler. From here then, and up to Wheeler. And the distance we find here is just around and a little bit over 520 kilometers, as you can see in the measure tool there. In the middle row we have 520.2, just thereabouts. If you look here in the window, 520.2, a little bit less. So let's now fly down to Cerro San Rafael and measure in miles, where we should find 520.2 thereabouts in miles. And here is the very peak of this, the highest mountain in northern Mexico. Cerro San Rafael, Google has also marked it right here, and here is the peak. If you look in the middle row here again, 520.2 and a little bit less in miles. So there we had it, that the ratio here is 1 kilometer and 1 mile again between those two distances. So that was that pair. Let me do a few more pairs to really attempt to drive the point home here. And this time it's from the mountain we reached last here, Cerro San Rafael, the dominating peak in northern Mexico, up to two mountains, the two dominating, you can say, in the eastern United States. The highest of them all is here, Mount Mitchell in North Carolina. And if you go even further to the northeast, we have Mount Washington in New Hampshire as the highest peak in the very northeasternmost New England area, you can say. And it turns out that this is very close. It's off by a few hundred meters here. Cerro San Rafael to Mount Mitchell is 1 kilometer, while to Mount Washington is 1 mile. It is close, but let me show you that this also works over quite long distances. So first in kilometers to Mount Mitchell from here. So let's fly to Mount Mitchell. And the very peak of Mount Mitchell here in North Carolina is just around here. And here we have a distance of 2,094 kilometers or 2,095. 2,094 up to 2,095, two values there. And if we now fly instead to Mount Washington in New Hampshire and shift to miles, we are very, very near exactly that again, 2,094. Here we have very peak here, Mount Washington, 2,093.5 almost, and 2,094.4. It should have been this long, a little bit longer beyond the peak, a couple of hundreds of meters, for it to be exact, this ratio, but it's very, very close. So again, over very long distances, this also works really well, and you have to allow for a bit of a small discrepancy. But I've seen this all around the world between mountain peaks. So that was that pair. Let me continue with a few more. Hope I don't bore you to death here. And this time we'll turn back to the west here and the Rockies and even into Canada here. And these are again dominating mountain peaks up here. Two distances I've marked out. One is from Granite Peak, Montana's number 1, up to Mount Robson here in the Canadian Rockies. Number 1 in all of the Canadian Rockies. Think of this distance as 1 mile. Then this other distance between Bora Peak, Idaho's number 1, and Mount Rainier, Washington State's number 1, is as 1 kilometer. Again, very near, very, very near exactly. So let's measure these. First, Granite to Robson. Granite Peak to Robson in miles. And here we are again at Montana's number 1 mountain peak, Granite Peak. So in miles from here up to Mount Robson in Canada. Number 1 in the Canadian Rockies then. So here is the very peak of Mount Robson, if it just clears up in a second here. The peak is right around here, and we have a distance of sort of the average value of the two distances is around 792.7 thereabouts in miles, 792.7. Let's now shift to kilometers, and measure the other distance here. Between Bora Peak and Rainier. So let's fly to Bora Peak first. And we should here then find 792.7 kilometers. So let's see if that's correct. And right here we have Bora Peak in just a second. Right here. So let's measure from here now in kilometers to Mount Rainier. And here, just on the western rim of the crater, we find the very highest point on Mount Rainier, right here. And that's also where Google has marked it, the high point. I've placed the pin here. And if you look in the measure tool, we have very close to the average value of these two distances is also 792.7. We should have had a little bit longer, but a very tiny margin of error here. So these two distances, again, we have the ratio between two of 1 mile and 1 kilometer between two distances. Let me do the final pair now. Hope you haven't fallen asleep yet. I take these two away and add these instead. Sorry, this isn't yet the final pair. Almost there. There's one more after this. And this time we'll keep the distance between Mount Rainier and Bora Peak and think of this distance as 1 mile. Compared to this other one, between Mount Rainier and Golden Hind on Vancouver Island, which is the number 1 peak there on the center of the island. This distance is as 1 kilometer. So let's measure both of these then from the peak of Mount Rainier. And first in miles now, we can take the kilometer distance to Golden Hind first. So from here then up to Golden Hind. Which is right here. And here we should find the distance. And here in a second is the very peak of Golden Hind. Here we should find the distance of around 430.4 or 5 kilometers, as you can see in the measure tool here. 430.4 or 5 if I put the line back here. 430.4 to 5. Let's now shift to miles and measure the other distance from Mount Rainier to Bora Peak in miles, where we should find 430.5, let's say, in miles then. And here we're back at Bora Peak. Its very peak is right here. And if you look in the measure tool here, we have 430.5 in miles here. Right there. So that was the second to last example. Now comes the last. Hope you are still awake. So let me take these two away and add the last example of kilometer-mile ratios here. And this is again in this very region. And we'll come back to Mount Robson here and measure down from Mount Robson down to Bora Peak. Think of this distance as 1 mile. And then we go to a mountain just south of Mount Robson, Mount Columbia here in the Canadian Rockies. This is the second highest mountain in the Canadian Rockies. And its distance to Mount Rainier is as 1 kilometer. So let's measure those two and begin with Robson to Bora in miles. So here we are at the peak of Mount Robson again. And the distance we are going to see here in a little while to Bora is just around, let's fly to Bora Peak now, is just around 667 in miles. 667. And back to Bora Peak. If you look in the measure tool there, we have very near 667, and here even 666.6 and so on. There, but let's say 667 in miles here. So let's shift to kilometers and then fly to that mountain. We can fly to Mount Rainier and measure to this Mount Columbia in the Canadian Rockies. Here is Mount Rainier again, and we are looking for 667 kilometers in this distance. If it just clears up here. So there we have the peak and off to Mount Columbia. And let's see if we have 667 kilometers here. And the peak of Mount Columbia looks a little bit odd in Google Earth actually. I think there may be a bit of a glitch here, I'm not sure. But this is the very peak here, and there is a very steep cliff. But nevertheless, the peak is as it should be according to Wikipedia, and the height is also as it should be. So this is there, the peak. And here we have 667 kilometers on Mount Columbia. So that was the final example of how the kilometer-mile ratio very commonly, and I actually have more examples of that here between mountains in North America, but I have to limit it somewhat. And that this was the first video, maybe I'll get back to others if it's interesting to someone. But I want to add one more example to show that not only the ratio between the kilometer and the mile orders mountains in North America here, there are other ratios between these units. And I'll give you one example of the meter-yard ratio, that between 1 meter and 1 yard, ordering really big and important mountains here in North America. So I'll add those lines or distances now. There are two distances then. And here the distances are both from Mount Whitney in California, the highest mountain in the lower 48 states, Mount Whitney. And it has a distance north to Mount Logan, which is the second highest in North America and Canada's number one. And a distance to the south, to Mexico, to Pico de Orizaba, which is the third highest in North America and Mexico's number one. And here the ratio is exactly Whitney to Mount Logan is as 1 meter, while Whitney to Pico de Orizaba is as 1 yard. That's the ratio precisely between these two distances. So let's measure those then. First, Mount Whitney. Let's go down to Mount Whitney and measure from there. First in meters to Mount Logan in Canada. And here in a second we have the very peak of Mount Whitney. Right here, there it is, and we fly up north to Mount Logan in a short while. Now we do that. So here we have then the very peak of Mount Logan after it's cleared up a little bit. There we are. I think it's cleared up. You can see Google has marked the mountain here also, and my marker is the purple one. And if you look in the top row window here, the map length, the distance to this peak is 3093.37. See, 3093.37, you can say, in meters. 3093.37. So let's shift to yards now and fly down to this Pico de Orizaba, Mexico's number one. And it's, by the way, it's the highest volcanic peak also in North America, Pico de Orizaba. And here we have that mountain, and its very peak is just around here. And if you look in the top row here, the map length distance, and right here is the peak. We have 3093.33 thereabouts in yards. 3093.33. It's off by a few tenths of meters of being exactly then 1 meter and 1 yard between these two distances, between these really big mountains here in North America. These. And there are a good number of more examples where two mountain distances in North America here are ordered by this ratio. But I just wanted to add one here to as a starter maybe, or to show it so that you see it for yourself. Well, if you've been with me for this long, I'm very happy that you have been, and I thank you for your attention, and I hope you're doing fine and everything, and so on. Thank you very much for staying with me.